Let's get started. All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Exploring Generational Trauma. My name is Keisha Ferguson, and I would like to begin by saying thank you for sharing this virtual space with me and all the participants on today's meeting. Dewan Collick, Tanisha Cameron, and I are all co-leaders for the Goals Employee Resource Group. For those of you not familiar, GOALS stands for Growing Our African American Leaders System Wide. The purpose of the ERG is to develop all employees to become dynamic leaders at both Christiana Care and their respective communities. Our mission is to provide resources to develop our members and provide opportunities for growth at work, home, and community. We provide a nurturing environment to share unique perspectives and embrace inclusion. Before we get started, I would like to go over just a few ground rules. Please be sure to turn your cameras off and mute your microphones and keep it on mute throughout the conversation unless you are speaking. Although muted, we encourage you to stay engaged by the way of the chat feature and Microsoft Teams. Some of this discussion that may happen will come from our own experiences and feelings. If you would like to engage in the conversation, feel free to submit your thoughts in the chat box or raise your hand at the end and we'll do our best to respond. You may also send me a private message if you wish to remain anonymous. As your moderator, I will be actively reading your comments and looking for questions and comments. My role is to be your voice during this event. To be clear, in alignment with Christianity Care's core values and behaviors, during this conversation, we will embrace diversity and show respect to everyone. Any comment that is deemed inappropriate, hurtful, or does not align with our core values of love and excellence will be deleted. We do, however, encourage all participants to fully engage and be transparent. Thank you. I will pass this to Marshall Hawkins. He's the co-leader for One Generation Employee Resource Group. He will introduce One Generation and our keynote speaker, Dr. Christina Watlington.
Thank you, Keisha. Like Keisha said, my name is Marshall Hawkins, and I am the co-chair for One Generation here at Christiana Care. And it is our mission to create connections between each of the generations in the workplace here at Christiana Care. And we are proud partners with Goals for today's event of exploring generational trauma. Dr. Christina Watlington is our presenter for today and received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and her bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College. She has over a decade of experience working with clients with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and related disorders. As an early career psychologist, she was a coordinator for the Returning Veterans Outreach, Education and Care Program at the VA Maryland Healthcare System. Following her 6-year tenure at the VA MHCS, she worked for a large behavioral health company, Pathways Human Services, and a variety of leadership roles. Delaware Clinical State Director and Director of Consulting, Education, and National Clinical Director. Dr. Watlington is the president of a mental health private practice, Dr. Watlington and Associates. In her clinical practice, she delivers cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatments to adults and adolescents with a wide range of emotional, behavioral, and adjustment concerns, such as anxiety, stress, and depression. She also is an executive director for a non-for-profit organization, Rise and Shine Women's Support Services, whose mission is to empower and encourage women to live their best life through workshops, conferences, and positive online inspiration. A passionate and humorous presenter, Dr. Watlington enjoys presenting on a variety of topics such as living a valued life, understanding our children through trauma-informed lens, understanding racial trauma, creating trauma-informed schools, and managing stress. She is currently working on 2 books, one related to dealing with racial trauma and the other related to ways women can manage stress. Dr. Watlington is an active member of the Delaware Psychological Association, where she serves on the Diversity Committee. She is also a member of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. And in 2019, she was honored to be a recipient of the Bridget Medal for her alma mater, Franklin and Marshall College, for outstanding achievement in her profession. Thank you, Dr. Watlington, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here during your lunchtime to talk to you about exploring generational trauma. And this seems like a really exciting venue with all the great work that you all are doing. So it's an honor to be here. You know, when I think about this topic of exploring generational trauma, I think about the fact that in 2020, if folks did not understand what trauma was, they got acquainted with trauma. 2020 was a year. We're still experiencing the aftermath of that year, but it was a year when we began to deal with this global pandemic. We were trying to figure out what this virus was and how is this virus impacting us and our families. People lost lives. People were scared. People are trying to transition to working from home and doing things like this virtually. And in tandem with that, we were also dealing with the racism pandemic that has been here for 400 plus years. So the confluence of those pandemics made it very, very difficult and made us really think about how horrific things can impact mind, body, and spirit. And so today I'm sharing space with you to talk about generational trauma. And this is trauma you get from your mama or your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather or great-grandmother. And this is important to talk about because once we can name something, we can heal from it. So we're going to be talking about what it is, but we're also going to take time to talk about how to heal from this, because I do believe we can grow through the things that we go through. So this is the presentation overview. We will be defining generational trauma, the related forms of trauma. We'll identify factors that influence and exacerbate generational trauma. We'll describe ways to heal generational trauma. So a couple of things about how do you show up. I do a lot of training on trauma-informed care, and there's like typically 3 pillars of trauma-informed care, but I threw in an extra one. One is that it's important to create a space that's safe. So when I talk about content that might be unsettling, I'm going to give you a warning. I do understand that what's a trigger to you may be neutral to me, so I won't be able to identify all of your triggers. So it's really important to practice managing your emotions. Do what you need to do to take care of you, whether that means taking a deep breath, whether it means getting up and stretching, whether it means getting something to drink. I encourage you to practice good self-care. Also, connection's really important. We really thrive in the place of healthy connection. And I won't be able to do like breakout groups with you and things like that today to connect with you. Hopefully at the end, we'll have time for Q&A, but I'm also going to leave my email address so you could contact me should you have any questions that I don't have time to answer today. And I've been doing this thing for a minute, and I have not come across any research that has said that you can listen to a presentation, check your email, check your Instagram, check your Facebook, and retain all the information. So I'm going to encourage you to practice presence, being here now. It's a gift, so why not give yourself that gift? And hopefully you can retain more information as a result of your commitment to being present. So I love to tell stories, and in honor of the topic of generational trauma, and in honor of Black History Month, I'm going to tell you a story that's rooted in African tradition. It's the story of Sankofa. Now, I like telling the story, and I edit it to make it my own, but the content of the story is still pretty much the same. And the rationale for the story is this will be woven throughout the content of what we discuss, because the moral of the story is very relevant to what we'll be talking about. So here we go. Once upon a time, there lived a bird named Sankofa. Now, Sankofa grew up in this really awesome village. And in this village, Sankofa had a great group of family members and friends. Sankofa felt safe, and she felt loved, and she felt nurtured. She felt like she mattered. You know, she had a good sense of self-esteem. But like some birds do, one day Sankofa decides to venture out. She wanted to explore. She was curious about what was outside of her village. And when she did, she met a big old bird. We're going to call him Big Bird, but it's not the Big Bird from Sesame Street. So she meets this big bird. Now, this big bird didn't show up with like that nice, gentle energy. This big bird had an issue. And so the big bird made her second guess herself, made her doubt her worth, made her feel a little anxious about herself, made her not feel so good. It was really different than what was familiar to Sankofa's experience. So Sankofa wasn't about that life, and Sankofa decided she's going to return to her village. When she does, she's embraced by people in her village. She remembers who she is. She has a little bit more pep in her step. She could hold her head up high. She felt safe. She could trust people. She had a sense of belonging. She knew how to manage her feelings. That village felt good. And so sometimes, like what we do when we want like a good revenge story, she decided to return on that journey again. And when she returns on the journey, she comes across the big bird again. But this time, the big bird wasn't able to bring her down. This time, Sankofa stood firmly in the truth of who she was. She had self-confidence and compassion and a good sense of self-worth. And so the big bird couldn't do anything. And so what happened was the big bird vanished. Sankofa returns back to her village, and everyone in her village applauds her for the strength and this courage to stand firmly in the truth of who she is. And so they carved out this image that you see before you as a reminder that as she moves forward in life, she must always look back to remember where she came from. The idea is that you must always remember the past, for therein lies the future. If forgotten, we are destined to repeat it. So this was a story that resonated from generation to generation because of Sankofa learning about who she really was. When we talk about this, it's very relevant for the conversation about trauma. We may not have to look that far away to remember a story that's horrific or that's painful or that's hurtful. But if we don't have it in our own personal life, when we talk about generational trauma, it's like our ancestors coming on and touching us with their stories that may shake us just a bit, that may make us question who we are, in a way that we have to kind of stand firmly in understanding those stories so we could really dissect and understand why they happened and how they impacted who we are today, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So when we talk about trauma, it's important to understand what trauma is. There's 3 E's of trauma. And often we use this term interchangeably with stress, and it's not the same thing. There's like positive stress and there's tolerable stress, but toxic stress, that's trauma. Because what trauma does is it overwhelms our capacity to cope. It causes wear and tear on the brain. But to say you experienced a trauma, there must be these three E's. There has to be an event. So the event could be physical abuse, emotional abuse. It could be racism, poverty, bullying, a car accident. And then it must be experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. We must keep in mind that the interpretation matters because what's dangerous to humans is not universal. 2 people can be exposed to the same event and experience it very differently. And then there are long-lasting effects. So once we understand those 3 E's of trauma and we have definition for it, then we could talk about this spectrum of trauma. Trauma is insidious. It can get us in all different ways. So we begin with adverse childhood experiences. These are things that happen to us before the age of 18. We're talking about emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. We're talking about things that happen in our household, like growing up in a household where your family members are separated, growing up in a household where you've witnessed domestic violence, growing up in a household where someone's abusing substances or where someone is in prison. And what we know is that 2/3 of us who are listening right now have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience before the age of 18. And if we experience one, we're likely to have experienced more than one. I have an ACE score of 3. So this is really important. because some of these experiences are manifestations of things that our ancestors in past generations have gone through. Then there's acute trauma. This is a single time limited event. This could be like a car accident. Then there's chronic trauma. This is prolonged and often multiple events that happen for some of my clients over their lifespan. When we talk about complex trauma and polyvictimization, we're talking about young children who are experiencing multiple traumatic events, often at the hands of caregivers. People who are supposed to keep them safe, who are supposed to help them feel secure and protected, like Sankofa and her village. But often the pain comes at the hands of those who are supposed to protect them. And then there's race-based trauma. It's racial slurs, microaggressions, the things people of color experience day in and day out, over and over and over again. It's not a low probability situation, it's high probability. And then it doesn't have to happen to you. Trauma doesn't have to happen to you directly, because we know about secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. And in these forms of trauma, just by hearing the stories of others who have experienced trauma, we start to take on some of those symptoms. There's also vicarious racism. Just seeing stories or images of Black and brown bodies being murdered before us, like the images of George Floyd, well, they can cause symptoms too. Nightmares and difficulty concentrating and being easily agitated and not feeling safe and being hypervigilant. And then we're going to talk about historical trauma and generational trauma in more detail. So what is important to understand in this conversation of trauma is trauma changes one's worldview. It changes how you see yourself, it changes how you see the others, and it changes how you see the world in 5 fundamental areas: safety, trust, power and control, having a sense of agency, feeling empowered. Intimacy, this is about our ability to connect with others, feel a sense of belonging. It's even our ability to self-regulate when we're feeling really, really stressed. And esteem, our sense of self-worth, and seeing the good in other people. And when these assumptions have been shattered, the result is some of the symptoms you see in front of you: the intrusion, avoidance, arousal and reactivity symptoms. But also what we know is more recently in the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, this fourth category of cognition and mood changes has been added, which emphasizes this idea of shattered assumptions, these negative beliefs that you begin to adopt. And this is important because if our great-great-grandparents have experienced trauma and that changes their worldview, how might that impact our worldview today? And we'll be talking about that in detail. So I'm going to tell you my family story, just so you get to know me just a little bit. I'm beginning here with a picture here. These are my great-grandparents, and they gave birth to this amazing man here. This is my grandfather. His name is Elmer P. Gibson. He was a chaplain in the Army. And he married this lovely woman, Melnise Gibson, my grandmother, a very strong, feisty woman. And they had my mom, Cornelia Gibson, and my uncle, Elmer P. Gibson, his picture's not here. I couldn't find that picture. And there's a couple of family stories that I grew up hearing, and I want to share them with you. My great-grandfather here was born into slavery. His mother was Black, his father white. And when he was really young, he was trying to learn how to read. But, you know, in a system of oppression, education is the tool for liberation. And so to keep people oppressed, you don't want them to have access to education. When my great-grandfather was trying to learn how to read, he recalls this notion or hearing that his hand would be chopped off if anyone caught him reading. His hand would be chopped off. Now, I don't know if that was his reality, but that was the reality of his time. And that's one of the stories that we heard about, me and my siblings, all the time. Like, it's amazing that great-granddad learned to read because he did so under horrific conditions, significant trauma. They give birth to my grandfather, Elmer P. Gibson, and he marries this lovely lady, Melnise Gibson. And they're growing up at a time where there's a whole lot of race-related trauma happening. They are growing up in the time of Jim Crow. And when they are living in Salisbury, Maryland, with my mother and my uncle, they shared stories of the KKK who would have these marches. And obviously those marches aren't anything good for people of color. And my grandmother would have to close the curtains, turn off the lights, and tell people, shh, just don't say anything. Because if we're seen, if we're visible, if we're heard, something bad will happen. My grandmother also told us a story of traveling down south with my mother and my uncle. My mother and my uncle were able to pass as white. My grandmother could not. If they were seated in a certain car, then my mother and my uncle were not able to call my grandmother their mother. She would say, don't call me mama, because if they find out, something bad would happen. She had to pretend to be their maid or their caretaker. When you think about some of these stories, what impact can stories like that have on a family? There's definitely a history of mental health concerns in my family, anxiety and depression and trauma-related symptoms, because these experiences shape one's worldview about safety. Who do I trust? Where do I feel safe? Do I have a sense of agency? Who do I really connect with? And what does it mean about my self-worth if I have to even pretend that my mom is not my mama? So it kind of changes our worldview. So it's important to keep in mind when we think about these things, what is a story of hardship in our family? But we want to look at things dialectically, right? We can hold two opposing things in the same space. We can have a story of hardship, but we also have a story of victory. And what's a story of triumph? So when we're talking about historical and generational trauma, they're related, but they're not related. So I'll explain that. Historical trauma is that cumulative emotional and psychological harm that happens as a result of group traumatic experiences. This is Native American genocide. This is the Black Holocaust. This is the Jewish Holocaust. So it's happening to a group of people. When we think of generational trauma, we're talking about trauma that's happening within families that's certainly impacted by historical trauma. It could be. In the example here, we have a pattern of maternal abandonment of a child, might be seen across generations. It could be a pattern of having children out of wedlock. It could be a pattern of substance abuse that you see from generation to generation to generation. So it's important to take a moment and just reflect. How does generational trauma show up for you if it does? Here's some questions to consider. Has anyone in 3 generations of your family experienced the death of a child? Has anyone in 3 generations of your family experienced abuse or domestic violence? How about losing a significant piece of their cultural heritage? How about divorce? How about poverty? Experiencing a hate crime, racism or stigmatization, sexual violence, moving into a new country, and so on and so forth. And it wouldn't be surprising if you say yes to at least one of these items, because many of us have had some exposure to trauma. So the research tells us that Native Americans are at greater risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder than other groups. Why might this be? Well, this could be the forced removal from their land, broken treaty promises, the introduction of disease and alcohol into their communities. And so this is an example of generational trauma shared by a Lakota parent in recovery. This parent says, I never bonded with any parental figures in my home. At 7 years old, I could be gone for days at a time and no one would look for me. I've never been to a boarding school. Keep in mind that boarding schools were really horrific places for children to go because it was about stripping them of their identity and culture. It was about assimilation. So I've never been to a boarding school. All of the abuse we talked about happened in my home. If it happened by strangers, it wouldn't have been so bad, sexual abuse and neglect. Then I could blame it on another race. In this case, this was something that happened in the home. Trauma changes worldview. What might the trauma of this person's ancestors be to have this person be in a situation where they experienced trauma growing up? There's a story there. So what we know is that trauma not transformed is trauma transferred. And there's a variety of ways this can happen. There's this really good book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And the person who came up with this concept, this theory, her name is Dr. Joy Leary. And what she said is that for people of African descent, because of multi-generational trauma, so this generation that begins at the time of being enslaved, that goes on from generation to generation with ongoing oppression, coupled with absence of opportunities to access the benefits available in society, lead to certain behaviors that make up post-traumatic slave syndrome. So Dr. Leary has a video where she talks about a white mother talking to a black mother, and they're talking about their children. The black mother says to the white mother, "How's John doing in school?" The white mother says, "Oh, John's doing really well. He really was doing better with geometry. He's doing amazingly well. You know what? Tell me about Tanya." The black mother says, "Oh, she's so hard-headed. We don't even need to talk about Tanya. We're just going to leave her alone," right? Now, that's an example. Of course, that doesn't mean that's how every black parent is going to respond, but the idea is to represent post-traumatic slave syndrome. The idea is that if in generations past, if my great-great-grandmother is out in the field picking cotton, and the overseer comes and the overseer is looking at her child, my great-great-grandmother knows that this is not good. So what she needs to do is she needs to degrade her child. Well, she ain't nothing. She's worthless. She's lazy. She's shifty. You don't want her. Now, degradation is protection. Degradation is protection. But what if that idea is passed on from generation to generation to generation? And certainly when folks are dealing with extreme forms of oppression, their access to mental health resources might be very limited. Certainly my great-grandfather didn't have the opportunity to talk to a trauma therapist at the time he was growing up to talk about his fear about his hand being cut off because he was learning how to read. So it's this combination, right? Perfect storm, perfect ingredients that make up post-traumatic slave syndrome. And also, when you're dealing with systems of oppression, there's things that have to happen to maintain the system. So even survival is a form of mental illness. In this case, there's something called drapetomania. And the idea is that this is a form of mental illness that causes enslaved Africans to want to be free. Very interesting. This idea that freedom is an idea, it signifies one's mental illness. There's something wrong with that, but that maintains a system of oppression. So I'm going to show you a clip, and many of you have probably seen Roots. So this is a trigger warning. If this is not going to be a pleasant clip. So if you don't want to listen to this, you might want to turn down your volume or look away for just like a minute. But I'm going to let you know what's going to happen in the clip. And after the clip, we're going to do an exercise together to regulate. In this clip, you see Kunta Kinte. He's being asked to change his name, and he's being beaten by the overseer until he chooses to change his name. And then I'm going to share with you what this is about and how it's linked to our conversation.
Say your name. Your owner's wife chose for you. Say your name so you know this ain't Africa. This is Virginia, and you're the property of John Waller, like the horses and hogs, nothing more. Say your name so you know what you are. Say it. Say it. Say it! Say it! Say your name! Say it! Say Toby! Tell me your name! Say it, damn you! Say Toby! Just say your name! You see? Say it again. Louder. What's your name? What's your name? You see it? That's what I'm saying.
I'm going to take you into a breathing meditation just so we can regulate.
So sitting comfortably, just taking a big deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. As you breathe in, noticing how the body expands. As you breathe out, just watching the body soften as you gently close the eyes. And rather than the mind leading the breath, allow the breath to lead the mind. Notice the sensation of the breath. Notice it where you feel it in the body. If you need to, you can just gently place your hand on the stomach. And just following that rising and falling sensation. Nothing else to do. Allowing thoughts to come and go. And when you're ready, just gently opening the eyes again. So sitting comfortably.
So when we see that video, and there's nothing cute about that, if you're familiar with that, if you've seen the film Roots, but you can be familiar with that just seeing everyday images. We are exposed to those things, unfortunately, quite often. And we could be looking at that and thinking about what happened way back in the day, but we can also think about, again, images of police brutality that have been all over social media, or other images where people are harmed and hurt and are feeling helpless. We could be thinking about people who are losing a sense of their cultural identity. There's so many things that are reminiscent, that are parallels to our experience today. So I have a QR code here, and because there's this really good article by Dr. Kenneth Hardy called The Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma, where he identifies these certain behaviors that are kind of residual effects of racial trauma. And so it's good if you just scan your phone over that, you should be able to, it should link you to the article. And he, along with Dr. Joy Leary, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, come up with a couple of these behaviors that are really kind of linked together. So I'm going to share these, and they don't just apply to people of African descent. This applies to anyone who's experienced a form of trauma related to being marginalized and oppressed. So there's this notion of this assaulted sense of self that you might see families not defining themselves by who they are, but who they aren't. This idea that I'm not stupid, I'm not ugly, I'm not worthless. You begin to, your sense of self has been so assaulted that you have to define yourself by what you're not. That does some damage, that does some work, psychological work. Then there's this internalized evaluation. Remember, if degradation is a form of protection, what if that degradation gets passed on from generation to generation, where children are hearing stories that they're not worthy, they're not good enough. And if they're not hearing it from family, what if they're hearing those messages in society? What does that do? And then there's this vacant esteem, because we are living in a day and age where too many people are not scared of dying, but we are scared of living. There's high suicide rates because we don't know what to do with all this emotional pain. And that leads to internalized voicelessness. You know, if you're devalued enough and you don't have a good self-esteem, and there's this assaulted sense of self, where at some point you're going to feel powerless. And then that can lead to anger and violence. So there's no specific diagnosis for inherited trauma. You can't look this up in the DSM-5 and say, hey, okay, I have all the symptoms, but there's some signs of it. Depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger. These are all signs that a person might have a hard time regulating their emotions, which basically means not knowing how to cope with their emotional experience. Trauma overwhelms our capacity to cope, remember, right? So depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger. It could take the form of physical symptoms. Oh, my stomach hurts, or I have headaches. It could sometimes show up as PTSD. It could show up as violence. It could be difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. We can't heal the things we don't feel, but what happens when those emotions and thoughts are just too overwhelming that we don't want to bring them to the forefront? Well, we get really, really good at suppressing emotions. Actually, most of us who are listening are good at emotional suppression under a certain set of circumstances, but this is difficulty recognizing and expressing those emotions. A family history of trauma, abuse in families, internalized oppression, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the signs of inherited trauma. So epigenetics tells us that PTSD or trauma can change the way our genes are read. It's a really interesting thing. Like, it's this kind of new science. It's a study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Very interesting. So a psychologist, I think she's a psychologist or a psychiatrist by the name of Rachel Yehuda, did a lot of work with Holocaust survivors. And what she found was interesting. She found that children of Holocaust survivors who had PTSD were born with low cortisol levels similar to their parents. Now, some of you might be saying, no, with stress, there's high cortisol, but with trauma, there's the suppression of cortisol levels. Now, this increased their likelihood of reliving the PTSD symptoms of the previous generation. We also know that we are 3 times more likely to experience PTSD if one of our parents had PTSD. That's some stuff, right? Then there's pregnant women during 9/11. Women who developed PTSD passed on PTSD markers to their babies, unlike moms who did not develop PTSD. Trauma changes the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So we start to inherit stuff that doesn't even belong to us. We also know that early attachment is really important. And when there's unhealthy attachment, well, this contributes to generational trauma transmission. In this video, this is the infamous still face experiment. If anyone knows attachment theory, you probably have seen this video. And basically what you'll see is a mother, she's still facing her child. So in one part, she's engaging her child, and in the other part, she begins to still face her child. The idea with still facing is this notion of a parent that may have mental illness or trauma, who doesn't have a lot of, range of affect, and how that can impact a child.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
It's really nice to see the mother like start to show emotions again after that. It's kind of uncomfortable to see that child have that reaction, but that could be an example of emotional neglect. Children growing up in households where they're overlooked or they're made to feel invisible, or the parent doesn't have the skill set to co-regulate effectively with the child. A child doesn't learn. We didn't learn to self-regulate unless there was someone teaching us to regulate through co-regulation, regulating alongside of us. So that could be a pattern that's passed on from generation to generation. So factors that influence generational trauma, I've spoke about some of these things, but we'll repeat some. Enslavement, genocide, domestic violence, sexual abuse, hate crimes, unresolved emotions and thoughts about a traumatic event, negative repeated patterns of behaviors, untreated or poorly treated substance abuse and severe mental illness, poor parent-child relationships and emotional attachment, and being content with the way things are. These are some of the things that can influence generational trauma. So, there is something called post-traumatic growth, and we do grow through the thing. We are capable of growing through the things that we go through. So what might be some healing strategies? And I want to let you know this is not even exhaustive. There are more to it than this, but these are a few I wanted to share with you because this could be a heavy conversation. I want to bring a little bit of light into this conversation as well. So one thing is, you've heard me say earlier, you cannot heal the things you don't feel. And it's really important to acknowledge the deep emotional impact of generational trauma. Like, we got to name that stuff, right? Like, what in your past troubles you today? What are some patterns in your family that impact you? Do you have a troubled relationship with a parent or a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt? What's unresolved? What are some of the maladaptive family patterns that you may see in your family? Could it be domestic violence? Could it be substance abuse? Could it be a culture of secrecy where families members just don't talk about things because it's easier to kind of sweep it under the rug, so to speak? And then it's important to recognize the thoughts and feelings that are showing up for you. Again, you cannot heal what you don't feel, and just allow those experiences to be there without needing them to be anything else. And that's really not an easy thing to do, and that might take some professional support, but that is really an important part of the healing process. The other is, you see this woman hugging herself, and she's practicing compassion, self-compassion. This is this internal state that feeds our prefrontal cortex. What trauma does is it impacts those areas of the brain that are all about like fighting or freezing or fleeing. It's like you're constantly in a state of survival, having trouble concentrating and thinking about what's going to happen next, and not trusting people, and always, waiting for the shoe to drop. So those might be some of those things. And so compassion is really good at like tapping into that prefrontal cortex where we could be mindful and curious and open to experiences. But it's also important in this compassion work to know that our responses and reactions to generational trauma make sense. Listen, a lot of behaviors that we don't like, they were born out of something. That degradation there's nothing cute about degrading someone, but if it means survival, then it served a purpose. So it's understanding that our responses, our personal responses, may make sense. We're trying to find ways of coping. Abusing substances is not healthy. Is a way of trying to cope? Absolutely. It's not healthy. We just want to find healthier ways of coping. So giving ourselves the tenderness and care that's needed to go through a tough time, trying to understand and show patience regarding our own challenges, our flaws, but also being tolerant of our own shortcomings, but also the shortcomings of family members. In his book, it's a book on generational trauma. I have it on my last slide, so I have the name of his full book, but Rowland identifies healing sentences as a way to cope with generational trauma, and he's really an expert in this field, so pay attention to that last slide when I have his information. So he recommends maybe saying statements, you know, if you're thinking about a family member who went through something really difficult, you might say to yourself, instead of reliving what happened to you, I promise to live my life more fully. I will make something good come out of this tragedy. I will use what happened as a source of strength. Just some healing, some good healing sentences that can translate into healing work. And he goes into a lot more detail about that. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is a hard thing. If you are dealing with a family member or someone who caused you harm, this doesn't necessarily mean you throw yourself in or put yourself in a really bad situation or an unsafe situation. Forgiveness, though, is the idea of practicing good self-care and doing what you need to do to take care of mind, body, and spirit. We know that reduces pain and blood pressure, it lowers anxiety, depression, and stress. But part of forgiveness work is perspective taking. What were the situational pressures that made a person in your family behave the way he or she did? What were the background factors contributing to the person acting the way he or she did? What are the events in the person's life that led to the person having the personality that he or she does? There's a story, you know, there's this idea of an iceberg, right? We can see the behavior and we can hyper focus on that behavior, but what lies underneath is the history, the experiences, the harm, the trauma, survival mechanisms. And might we do deeper work to get to the core of that? And might that be helpful? It's important to calm the nervous system. With trauma, you're constantly in a state of like survival, as I mentioned. And so we want to just like, you know, drop our shoulders, so to speak. This improves our ability to cope with stress and it creates a sense of well-being. It helps us to be planted in the here and now. We did some of that after I showed you the clip of Roots. So it could be visualization, progressive muscle relaxation, body scan, but there's so many different, and there's amazing apps out there, Headspace, Calm, Insight Timer, to really help us to calm the nervous system. Of course, I'm a psychologist. I'm going to promote seeking professional help, but there's best practices. And so it's important to get connected to someone who has expertise, who's able to do the work to meet the specific needs of you and your family. And you also want to talk to someone who has an understanding of trauma and trauma-informed practices. And I have another QR code because I came across this good article by Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who talks about bringing the ancestor effect home. That's a picture of my mom. And it's really just about thinking about what are some healthy traditions you want to begin to invite into your family and pass on from generation to generation. So it begins with researching our roots. That's a powerful thing. Framing and making visible photos of your ancestors. Again, that's my mom. Developing your own traditions that help strengthen your family. So in my family, we do the pouring of libations for Kwanzaa and for significant family celebrations. So it's thinking about looking at really healthy traditions to invite into your family and pass those on from generation to generation. So it's important to attend to our stories. I began with the story of the Sankofa bird and this idea that she had to go back and fetch it, get some information, remember who she was. So attending to our family stories is really important, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's nothing is defined once and for all, right? There's this cognitive flexibility. We want to land in the place of the middle. Things are not all bad or all good. We want to find the gray. And so it's good to hear our stories, to know about our family strengths and what our families have overcome. And even family members that you may give the crooked eye to because you don't like them so much, they probably have a story that's important to know. The worst thing you could take from a people, the worst thing you can take from a family is the memory of themselves. So it's really empowering to give you the sense of agency, because remember, trauma shatters this sense of power and control, and we all want a sense of agency, So the worst thing you can take from a people is the memory of themselves. So learning about our family stories and embracing them and seeing how they could work for us rather than against us. So in summary, we owe it to ourselves and our loved ones to break the cycle of generational trauma. Our birthright is to be well. Not everything we inherit is worth passing on to our children and future generations. So we want to be present and mindful of that stuff and pump the brakes. It's important to acknowledge our family stories, as I talked about, and it's important to identify healing strategies that work for you. When we share healing strategies, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Some will work for some and another set will work for others. So it's important to be mindful of that. So I will close with this quote. When we heal ourselves, we heal the next generation that follows. Pain is passed through the family line until someone is ready to feel it, heal it, and let it go. My hope is that you heard some information today that allows you to begin the work of healing things and letting go of what you don't need to hold on to. Thank you so much for your time, and I think we have like 5 minutes for questions. So thank you. I'm going to see if I can see people and get this screen closed, because I wanted to end with it being nice and clean, but I don't think it's going to. Let me see.
Well, that was an awesome presentation. We thank you for coming to share all of that with us today. I did have one question that was submitted to us earlier today. And the question reads, can you please expand on how, as a person of color, we get past the everyday offenses that silently come our way, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally?
Say the first part, I'm sorry.
Can you please expand on how, as a person of color, we get past the everyday offenses that silently come our way, sometimes intentionally and unintentionally?
We get past the offenses? Or how do we get past the offense? Oh, how do we get, okay, how do we get past them?
Get past it, yep.
Who asked that question?
Oh, they didn't leave a name.
That's okay, that's fine. I just want to speak to them to make a connection. But whoever that was, that's a great question, right? So the thing about racial offenses, which is interesting, and we do not have a lot of information in the field of psychology about best practices around this, because what's insidious about race-related trauma is that it happens every single day. There's something called racial battle fatigue, that this idea that you could be having breakfast with some friends, you could be watching something on television, you could pass someone in the street, and there might be a microaggression. You see, when you do trauma work, exposure-based therapy or cognitive work, I would say to a client, well, you were in a car accident. It's a low probability that that's going to happen again. You cannot say it's a low probability when it comes to racism. This is an everyday thing. This puts people in fight, flight, or freeze. Now, there are self-preservation strategies. The healing work does begin with, you still got to talk about it. So some of these things are still the same. You have to name that you're experiencing it. You have to give yourself a practice, a good self-care practice to help work through it. You have to have a tribe of people that you trust, because often with trauma, remember, it shatters assumptions about trust. So you have to have the right people who you can talk to be real about what you're experiencing. and learn not to whisper when it comes to conversations about race. And you also need to find a way to empower, to empower oneself. So engaging in social activism work or contributing to a cause, to anti-racism work, whatever the case may be, it's finding a way to have a sense of agency. And of course, if you're working in environments that are that toxic, you may need to just get out, if it's feasible. I know we got to pay our bills, but it might be healthy to go. I hope that helps, whoever that was. And if not, I do have my, I stopped. Was I sharing my screen before? You all saw my screen, right? Okay. I'm not sharing it now.
Yes. So no, you're still sharing. We can still see. We can see the helpful resources.
Oh, you can see. Okay. You see, I don't know what's going on. Right here. Yeah, this is my contact information. So if I haven't, do I have my email address? No, I don't. So it's cwatlington@drwatlington.com. That's CWATLINGTON at DR Watlington. Again, WATLINGTON.com. If I didn't answer that question, please email me. I'm really good at responding. So that's an important question. I want to do right by it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think this presentation was powerful. You got a lot of comments in the chat just thanking you, saying that it was a fantastic presentation, powerful. Thank you, Kristen, for putting a lot of the resources that she went over in the presentation in the chat box for anyone to get to. Excellent presentation, inspiring, wonderful. Thank you for the very deep and comprehensive discussion. So it was great. Does anyone on the line have any questions at all? You could put them. I know we're kind of at time, but if you have any questions at all, she did give us her email information, which we will put in the chat for you. And I'm just scanning just to make sure I got everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I did. Make sure. A comment: would really love this to be a mandatory learning for leadership.
Well, thank you.
That was good.
I'll come on back.
All right.
Is that it? Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate, again, I'm so honored to be here. Navigating, my anxiety was around navigating the system. But
you did good.
I figured that out. See, I was going through what I was going through right there in real time. How about that?
Yeah.
So, but this is hard stuff. And so I'm aware when we have these conversations, people don't skip away seeing butterflies and unicorns after these talks. It should make you think about things. But I would really encourage people, if they have any additional questions, even if someone was triggered and, they're feeling some type of way, I think it's important to have agency to name it. And I'm more than happy to have you reach out for any questions and any resources you may need. Okay.
All right. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Watlington, One Generation, Goals, and Kristen Isaac for assisting with bringing this event to life. I want to thank all of you that attended today, and I hope you were able to get valuable information out of what was shared today. In solidarity, we are committed to equity, inclusion, fairness, and justice for everyone we serve. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks,
all right, thank you, everyone.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.